So indeed, I'm going to talk about Hungarian verbal particles. And I'll just start out with a brief introduction on the cross-linguistic picture, and then also on the diachronic picture, and then turn to two case studies. So what I'm going to discuss is the grammaticalization of verbal particles from adpositional elements, and this is cross-linguistically taken to be the case that verbal particles typically grammaticalize from adpositions. I take two defining properties to be important for something to be considered a particle. One is that it is to some extent functional, so it has grammaticalized from its source lexical item, and that it's productive, so it has a different distribution from the source category. And I will show two grammaticalization contexts to entering a path of possible further changes. So, but actually the part of the change which I take to be the crucial part in becoming a verbal particle. So while these two, the two patterns will have different sources, we will end up with verbal particles in both case studies that I will show you. And then I will not really motivate the change in a broad context syntactically, but it is an observable fact that in Hungarian throughout its recorded period, more and more it is the case that the result or the endpoint has to be obligatorily lexicalized separately from the verb. So Hungarian has become strongly satellite framed throughout its history, and so the tendency that you will see that we have lots of verbal particles is kind of a part of this broader picture of the language lexicalizing satellites separately from the verb. So I will show you two patterns. The first one is basically the typical one, at least for Hungarian, but I think cross-linguistically too, is that it's a case when a directional postposition becomes a particle, a goal denoting particle, and in the one item I will show you in a little bit detail, we will see that it's a little bit more complex at the starting point, but the crucial changes from a postposition to a particle, and structurally I will take it to be a change where essentially a path head becomes a more functional head in an extended adpositional phrase. The fact that this grammaticalization happens is facilitated by the status of directional and in general predicative phrases in a preverbal position in the language. The second study, the second example I will show you for a grammaticalization pattern involves a resultative secondary predicate, and by this I mean I don't want to imply that particles are not or that adpositions in general are not resultative. What I mean by resultative secondary predicate is that it's morphologically different from just general particle and postpositional cases. So it has a dedicated resultative morphology. So then this kind of a secondary predicate grammaticalizes into a predicative verb modifier with the functional meaning. And again, the fact that this happens is again facilitated by its preverbal status as a resultative secondary predicate in general. So the two kinds of particles will be shown to originate in different lexical and syntactic contexts, but both are undergoing a similar change and both involve PPs. And this might not be a necessary condition for becoming a verbal particle, but it is the case in Hungarian. So in Hungarian, in fact, all secondary predicates are adpositional in nature as well. So all of these items will involve adpositional phrases. So this is the outline. First, I will talk a little bit about the synchronic and diachronic properties of verbal particles in general in the language, and then I will turn to one case of a directional particle becoming a predicate, and then I will show you a resultative becoming a particle, sorry, also in the previous one, and then I will conclude. So again, cross-linguistically, what we find is that in many languages, there are both separable and inseparable verbal particles, also called preverbs or prefixes, especially when they are inseparable. And even a single language can have both of those, and we don't have to go far to find languages that have both of those. Now in Hungarian, all particles are separable. They are phrasal, and by this I mean that they project a phrase. So particles are heads themselves, but they do project a phrase, and they are syntactically independent. In neutral sentences, they are preverbal, and by neutral sentence, the Hungarian literature, which the Hungarian literature widely uses, is we mean non-negative, non-imperative sentences that contain no structural focus and no WH. Item. So in those sentences, particles are preverbal. Semantically, they generally tellicize an event, they contribute an endpoint or goal, and they are not regular arguments, but are secondary predicates in the argument structure of the verb, as has been proposed for very many languages, and as has also been proposed for Hungarian for a while now. So they do have aspectual properties, but syntactically speaking, they are, I take them to be secondary predicates. And even more precisely, I take them, grammaticalized particles, I take to be kind of like relators in the sense of Dan Deacon's relative phrase encoding. So for the internal syntax of phrases involving particles, I'm assuming a functional projection which hosts the particle itself in an extended PP, again following literature on Germanic in general and many other languages, and I've also proposed even more detailed structures than I'm going to propose now for Hungarian. So diachronically, it has been claimed that particles grammaticalize from adverbs or prepositions, postpositions, and they may undergo several steps as a part of a grammaticalization path or cline, and this chain in one has been proposed by Los et al. And is actually building also on previous work on English and Dutch specifically. So Hungarian particles are arguably or in the first stage if you take this path in one. So what I'm going to show here is to analyze the part of the process that leads up to these steps. So how PPs enter the grammaticalization at all, which might then result in further changes and structural reduction possibly. But Hungarian particles, as I said before, are all separable particles, and they all project a phrase as opposed to, for example, English or other Germanic languages. So let's now turn to Hungarian particles more specifically. All the oldest Hungarian verbal particles are directional. These are listed here. There's only one among these that has lost its lexical meaning by modern Hungarian, basically completely. So it's not used in its original counter-directional meaning back in modern Hungarian, but it was still partly directional in Old Hungarian. All the others have both less lexical or more just simply telliciizing and also still directional uses. And they are claimed to have originated as adverbs, and most of their roots are found in postpositions today too. And in 2, you see an example that where a sentence contains 3 particle verbs, and all of them are before the verb. So I actually did a study a few years ago checking the word order properties of particles in Old Hungarian, and what I found is that they were pretty much like behaving like they do today. In neutral sentences, at least. There are complications in non-neutral sentences, but they were preverbal in neutral sentences. And this is interesting when you compare them to non-particles, so to other secondary predicates, which were not always as uniformly preverbal as they are today. So there is more variation in Old Hungarian, but that disappears in Middle Hungarian. But the relevant part here is that the oldest particles behave like they do today. Even in the early text. So then we have various particles grammaticalizing in the written period, in the recorded period. I listed some of those. So what is interesting to see actually is that all the particles that, and there are more than I listed here. So from Old Hungarian, you find directional particles. From Middle Hungarian, you find directional particles. Again, so particles that originate in some spatial meaning. That's what I mean by directional. And I'm going to look at one of those, keresztül, meaning across, in a moment. And then when you look at modern Hungarian, so starting from the last quarter of the 18th century, you find also verbal particles that are not such directional particles in origin. So they do not originate in spatial postpositional phrases. And these are the ones that I'm calling resultative particles. They are all quite young. There's not many of them. They are quite young, but they conform to this criteria that I said in the beginning, that they are to some extent bleached, at least partly functional, and they are productive. So their distribution is wider than that of the lexical resultative would be. So then there will be reanalysis in the grammaticalization. And what happens then is that a path head, so a directional postpositional head, these are postpositional in Hungarian, is reanalyzed into more functional head in the extended adpositional spine, and I will call that, following the literature, little p. So, and then along with that grammaticalization, so it's grammaticalization up the tree, just simple head-to-head grammaticalization, and the lexical content changes. Typically, it loses some lexical content, or it just changes in its lexical content, and an endpoint is always involved when it becomes a particle. So in the case of the oldest particles, this is a step that has to be reconstructed, because they are all really well-behaved particles by the time we have the first records. But then the newly grammaticalizing particles actually can show you the steps that might have happened along the different stages of changing into a particle. Many of these newly grammaticalizing particles are also postpositions, and when they are postpositions, they take a case mark complement. This will be relevant in the case that I'm going to show you. And there is an extra step in the change in those cases, because generally speaking, we start out with an adjunct structure, and then the adjunct gets integrated into the phrase as a head, and then it can become a particle. So there are several relatively new particles that can show us how exactly it might proceed. The old ones are too grammaticalized already from the beginning to see the full process. And then before we actually go to the cases, a couple of words about resultatives. And so resultative phrases, the resultative secondary predicates in Hungarian are all adpositional phrases or postpositional phrases, strictly speaking. So, and some of the verbal particles that I've shown you before are grammaticalized elements from starting with resultative phrases as their source. So 3 just shows you a regular resultative secondary predicate. So you see that on the preverbal resultative, there is a case marker. So that's the sublative case, and the resultatives involve that. The depictives involve a different case, but all of those are case marked. But the relevant here is the resultative, the sublative case, because this is the case that we see in these newly developing particles that I'm calling resultative particles. So if you look at 4, and I put one of those into parentheses because it's slightly different. You can see it on the form too. It just semantically belongs to the same class, and I'm happy to talk about it later if you want to. But the relevant one I'm going to look at is újra, which morphologically goes back to new, and then the sublative case. So it looks like a resultative, and it has grammaticalized into a repetitive adverb and a restitutive particle. So then the syntactic environment for the grammaticalization is going to be slightly different from the one of directional particles. So this just shows you the context that we are actually dealing with resultative phrases, and we can see that because of the case ending. So now on to the directional particles. Keresztül is the one that I am going to show you examples of. So this means across. It occurs first in the early 16th century, and it appears in text as an adverb, or in the context where it may be an adjunct to a locative PP. So if you see look at the examples in 5 and 6, you see, and that they scatter everywhere or all over the place. That would be the keresztül. That's the best translation probably, to the four corners of the word. And that's the other, the bracketed postpositional phrase that you find somehow close by. They are either connected somehow or not, but it's just interesting to observe. And then in 6, again, you see, és az földön keresztül magát elterjeszti. So you see again, keresztül, across, it's best translated as crosswise. So someone fell to the ground in front of St. Francis, and he lay on the ground crosswise in front of him. And here you see a superessive marked PP next to a cross. We don't know if it's, if it's one phrase or not, if it's adjoined or not. It could, keresztül could well be just an adverb here. So the form itself, you might have guessed, involves kereszt, cross, and then it ends in an adverbial suffix, which might go back to the ablative suffix, but in Middle Hungarian already it's because of the vowel, we know that it's the adverbial suffix. The original meaning is crosswise, and the grammaticalization that happens is that it's, as I said, is an adverb or maybe an adverb adjoined to a PP, but it's a full PP on its own basically. And then it grammaticalizes into a postposition, and as we will see, it shows variable word order basically from the beginning. But when it's a postposition, it selects superessive case. So it's directional, and it selects a superessive place B. And then it becomes a particle, and the superessive place B is maybe a complement, but it's separated from it because the particle is preverbal and the PP is somewhere else. And then as the last step, basically there is no selection or restriction, so there might not be any additional PP in the clause. So let's say some examples. A 7 is the same as the one we saw before, so maybe 8 is more interesting. So that the two houses at the other end of the yard would not be separated crosswise, but lengthwise. So it's actually contrasted with another adverb. So it's on its own. There is no related PP anywhere in the sentence. So it's an adverb here. Then it's a postposition in 9. So for about a week, they go across her garden whistling, and whistling is preverbal, and the rest of it is postverbal. And then the 10 is basically the same thing, except here it's prepositional. So things that we call postpositions sometimes show varying word order where they have a case marked complement, but actually it's only typical of those, or mostly typical of those that also have a particle use. We had I had a paper of that with Eva Dékány a few years ago for modern Hungarian, not historically. So when we find examples where it's really a particle, like in 11 and 12, when it's before the verb and there is an associated superessive marked PP, but it's not, it doesn't form a constituent with keresztül. So in the early examples, it's always used with verbs like go, or put, or chase, or take, or pour, or step. And then later on, its distribution widens, and then it's used with verbs like look, or pierce, or dig, and different verbs. And I show you one example of that in 15. So in 15, there is no associated superessive anywhere, but it's a particle in front of the verb. And coordinated with another particle verb. But then what happens then in the grammaticalization is that, as I said, we probably originate with a positive or an adjunction structure, but then keresztül becomes a path denoting postposition, and then it can move up to a higher functional projection, and then later it becomes generated in that higher functional projection. And what I want to say about 15, in fact, is that it is at that point, it's at that point where it's generated higher up, and there is no selectional relation between place and path, that you find the examples where it's a particle and there is no associated superessive marked place P in the clause somewhere close by. So that's the grammaticalization steps that it goes through.
You have about 5 minutes.
Thank you. So that's what happens to directional. So they become a path head, and then they become a more functional. In the case of keresztül, what we see is that it's not actually becoming more functional, but it becomes goal denoting in its particle use, which was not typical of it. It was just directional, or in the adverbial use, it was sometimes just locative. But it becomes goal denoting. So it's a smaller semantic change, but it does widen the distribution. So it becomes more productive. So what happens then with resultatives? I'm going to look at the case of újra, which also appeared first in Middle Hungarian. The form, as I said before, is original, is morphologically bimorphemic. I think it's still to some extent transparent to speakers, but the meaning is not compositional now. So it contains the adjective új and then the sublative suffix, which is typical of resultative secondary predicates. So when we look at what has been said about it, then Csirmaz wrote a paper on various repetitive and restitutive adverbs in Hungarian, and she notes that two of those, there are several, two of those can be used as verbal particles, or rather she calls them verb modifiers, but she probably means the same thing. But in any way, they are not always adverbs. Sometimes they are something different. And then and these two are újra again and vissza. And if you remember, vissza was listed among one of the particles. You probably don't, because there were too many of those that developed early on, replacing meg actually as the counter-directional particle. But újra then is shown as a particle in 16. That's modern Hungarian. Anna újraírta a levelet. Anna rewrote the letter, and it can also be an adverb. And then in 17, you see clearly that it's not a particle, because there is a particle verb following it. So Anna újra lefest minden széket. So Anna paints every chair again. So actually there is paints down every chair again. And in this case, it can be ambiguous between the repetitive and the restitutive meaning. So the first data that we find, so that's the synchronic case. So the first data that we find are from the first half of the 18th century, and it's actually quite rare in Middle Hungarian. Other repetitive elements are used more frequently then. And the complicating factor when trying to figure out whether we are dealing with an adverb or a particle is that újra can be preverbal, like immediately preverbal in its adverbial use as well. So the previous example in 17 was chose in a way that you see that it's not a particle because there is a particle following it. But when there is no other particle, then sometimes it's not obvious whether we are dealing already, for example, in 18 with a particle, or it's just a regular adverb here. In 19, it's clear that it's higher up in the structure. And they also give back the wheat again, and then there is no difficulty in deciding whether it's a particle or not. But when we look at the early occurrences, what we find is as a potential particle. We find it with verbs like begin. That was also in the previous example, and also in 20. So begin again, or restart if you wish. Then there is be born, form create and another verb for create. These are the first verbs that it appears with basically until the mid-19th century. And then later on you find it with other verbs as well. So 21 shows a case with the verb live, so it's relive. So what I want to claim is that it starts out as a resultative phrase, and it's preverbal because of that. So it's preverbal because resultative phrases in general, secondary predicates are preverbal in the language, but then it gets reanalyzed, and it gets reanalyzed in two ways. It becomes both a repetitive restitutive adverb and a verb modifier with restitutive meaning. And then the adverb can be inserted higher in the structure. The verb modifier with restitutive meaning is inserted in the structure in the preverbal position, but right above the VP. That's how it gets always the restitutive meaning. And I call this position the specifier of a pred P, following Schwarz and Koster's and others' use of this position where secondary predicates are in the clause. So the reanalysis involves then first it's moved into the preverbal position as a regular resultative, and then it gets base generated there because of its lexical change, because of its becoming a functional element, basically just meaning it having a restitutive meaning. So then, so that's the resultative case. So then it appears with different verbs, and it grammaticalizes slightly differently. And I just want to very briefly say that I do have a few reasons for saying that these two kinds of particles are base generated in different positions, not only because of the morphological differences, but also because of their co-occurrence and syntactic difference with respect to their possible complements, and also because this resultative particle, for example, does not introduce an internal argument. So I take that to be an evidence that it's not a small clause predicate, but it's generated somewhere in a different position. And these are just examples.
If you want questions, then you need to stop.
Yeah, So I just this is the conclusion. We just basically quickly summarizes that there are two source contexts, and in the two source contexts, you arrive at particles from both of those, but those particles are slightly different. One remains in the argument structure of the verb, the other becomes a modifier above VP in its base position. And these modifiers are treated as verbal particles when they become generalized, when their use becomes generalized. And that's it. Thank you very much.